Hey everyone. I never thought I'd post something like this, but here we are. I'm a 36-year-old engineer, and my wife, well, ex-wife now, was a physics professor. I guess that's ironic considering what the story's about. We met in grad school, back when I was just some guy fascinated by machinery, and she was obsessed with theoretical models. She'd talk about Robert Oppenheimer like he was some tragic hero. The man who built the bomb but couldn't live with it, she'd say. I used to think that was just her poetic side. Fast forward to last year. Everything seemed fine. Routine arguments, shared dinners, the usual quiet evenings. But then I started noticing small changes. She'd stay late at the university more often. I'd get texts like still running tests or meeting with the department chair. I believed her at first. She'd always been a workaholic. But one night, she came home at 2 a.m., hair messy, eyes unfocused, smelling faintly of smoke and old paper. When I asked, she said, we were recreating Oppenheimer's theoretical chain reaction for a classroom project. Something about that sentence, it sounded rehearsed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened my laptop and did what every paranoid husband swears he'll never do. I looked her up online. Not on social media, she barely used it, but on her university's internal site. There, in the recent publications section, was a new paper draft titled Manhattan, The Emotional Weight of Creation. It wasn't about physics. It was a personal essay, and right in the abstract, she wrote, "To love someone while creating destruction is to become Oppenheimer himself." I sat there, reading that line over and over, wondering if I was the destruction. That's when everything started unraveling. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about that essay. To love someone while creating destruction. It kept looping in my head like a warning I'd ignored for years. I wanted to believe it was just her being dramatic. She had that kind of mind. But curiosity got the better of me. I copied the document title, opened a private browser, and searched it. And there it was, an early version uploaded to an open academic site. Same title, but this time, it had acknowledgments. Right there, in black and white. Special thanks to Dr. MG, whose insight reignited my understanding of passion and purpose. MG was her colleague, a newly hired physicist I'd met once at a faculty dinner. I remember him vividly, quiet guy, always asking her questions about quantum systems and ethics in creation. I didn't think much of it back then, but seeing his name in that essay felt like a punch to the gut. I clicked through, read a few paragraphs, and that's when it hit me. It wasn't just academic writing. She was using physics metaphors to talk about him. Phrases like, our experiments in parallel motion, and his energy collided with mine in ways theory could never predict. It was so coded, but anyone who knew her style could see it. It wasn't a paper about. That's what we're calling emotional intimacy now. She tried to explain. Said she and Dr. MG had been emotionally collaborating. Apparently, he helped her find her creative spark again. I asked if they'd slept together, and she didn't say no. She just said, it's more complicated than that. That was the worst part. Her refusal to even give me the mercy of clarity. She kept talking, pacing around our living room like she was presenting a lecture. She said the essay was a reflection on Oppenheimer's guilt, how he created something powerful and destructive because he felt unseen. She claimed she saw herself in that. Said she'd felt invisible in our marriage for years. That one hurt. Because maybe I'd been distant at times. I work long hours. I'm not the best communicator. But I was there. I was loyal. Then she said something that still echoes in my head. You and I built a life. But he and I built something alive. That was it. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just walked out. I drove around aimlessly for hours. Ended up parked outside a diner at 3 a.m., staring at my reflection in the window, wondering how someone you share a bed with could live a whole other life in their mind. She texted me once that night. Please don't hate me. You'll understand when you finish reading it. But I couldn't bring myself to open that essay again. I didn't need to. I already knew what it said. The next morning, I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, eyes red but calm, too calm. She looked like she'd accepted something I hadn't even processed yet. She started talking before I could even put my keys down. "I'm not leaving you," she said. It was almost funny, the way she said it, like it was her decision to make. I told her I needed space, that I couldn't pretend everything was fine. She nodded and said she understood, but then started describing how she'd already told her department chair about what happened. I froze. "What do you mean, told him?" I asked. She said she'd confessed that her emotional entanglement with a colleague had compromised her objectivity in her recent paper. That's when I realized this wasn't just an affair. It was about reputation, ego, guilt. She detonated her own career before I even decided whether I wanted to forgive her. Later that week, I got a call from MG's wife. Yeah, apparently he was married too. She'd found my number through a shared contact. Her voice was cold and tired, the kind of tired that comes from crying too much. She said, "I thought you should know. He's leaving the university. They're both being investigated for misconduct." I didn't know what to say. I felt bad for her. I felt bad for everyone. Somehow, no one had actually won. It was like everyone got hit by the same blast radius. That night, my wife, still my wife at the time, came home and told me she'd been asked to take a temporary leave of absence. She looked lost, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then she said something that flipped the switch again. Maybe this was necessary. Sometimes destruction is how you start over. I remember thinking, God, she really is living in her own Oppenheimer movie. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I started packing a few days later. Not everything, just essentials. A suitcase, laptop, a few shirts. I figured I'd crash at my brother's for a while. She didn't try to stop me, but she followed me around the apartment like a ghost, whispering things like, "You're overreacting, and it wasn't real love. It was just curiosity." Curiosity. That word hit harder than affair. Before I left, I went to grab my external hard drive from her office. She always kept it in the second drawer of her desk. That's when I noticed a small black notebook tucked underneath a stack of printed equations. Out of habit, or maybe masochism, I opened it. Inside were notes, sketches, and half-written paragraphs. But they weren't physics notes. They were drafts of letters. To me. To him. To herself. One line stopped me cold. He doesn't understand that I needed to break something to feel alive again. Then another, scribbled angrily beneath it. If he ever reads this, it means I couldn't fix what I destroyed. I closed the notebook, just sat there staring at it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about self-destruction. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to annihilate herself and anyone near her in the process. When I finally walked out the door, she didn't cry. She just said, "You'll see. This will make sense one day." I didn't look back. But as I drove off, I caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, standing on the porch, clutching that notebook to her chest like it was her last piece of truth. I told myself I was done. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. Because a week later, I got a letter in the mail. From her. The envelope was thin, cream-colored, and smelled faintly like her perfume, the same one she used to wear during our early years together. I almost didn't open it. I'd promised myself no more words, no more metaphors, no more explanations. But curiosity, yeah, the same word she'd used, got me too. Inside was a 3-page handwritten letter. The first line said, "I didn't betray you the way you think I did." She claimed that what happened between her and MG wasn't a love affair. It was an experiment. Not scientific, but psychological. She wrote that she'd been trying to understand the emotional mechanisms behind destructive genius. how people like Oppenheimer justified creating devastation for what they believed was a higher purpose. Apparently, she thought the only way to truly understand it was to walk the line between morality and chaos. Basically, she turned our marriage into a lab. She wrote that she had intentionally blurred the boundary between professional and personal life with MG. To see how far she could go before guilt took over, to measure human limits. She claimed she never actually slept with him, said the connection was intellectual and dangerous, and that she'd ended it before it crossed a physical line. Then came the part that made my hands shake. You were my control group, the one I thought was constant. But I was wrong, because when I watched you unravel, I realized I'd underestimated the human cost of theoretical damage. It was like she was apologizing, but through a research paper. Detached, analytical, almost proud. At the bottom, she'd written a quote. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Then, underneath it, in her handwriting, I finally understand him. I didn't even know what to feel: anger, pity, horror, maybe all three. I folded the letter back up, put it in a drawer, and sat there for a long time. I realized she hadn't just studied Oppenheimer. She'd become him, someone who thought destruction was just another form of creation. And that's when I knew I couldn't just walk away quietly. A week after that letter arrived, I asked her to meet me. Not at home, somewhere neutral. We ended up at this old coffee shop near campus, the kind of place where students read poetry and professors pretend to be normal people. She looked thinner, like the guilt had started eating away at her. When she saw me, she smiled faintly and said, "You read it." I just nodded. I told her I didn't come for apologies. I came for clarity. I wanted to hear, in her own words, what was real and what was theory. She took a deep breath and said, "Everything was real. The emotions, the confusion, the pain. I just try to make sense of it through the only language I know, science." I said, "You used people, including me, as test subjects." She looked down at her coffee and whispered, "Yes." It was surreal, watching her confess so calmly, like she was reporting lab results. But then her voice cracked for the first time. "Do you think Oppenheimer wanted to hurt anyone?" I didn't predict love could collapse the formula. I sat there stunned. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She'd turned our relationship into data, my emotions into evidence. And yet, the last line almost sounded like regret, like she hadn't expected to actually hurt me. There was also an envelope taped to the back cover. Inside was a small photo, one we took years ago at a science museum. She'd written on the back, "This is what I was trying to preserve. I just didn't know how." I stared at that photo for a long time. For the first time since everything started, I didn't feel angry. Just empty. Like I'd been erased and rewritten into a study no one asked to participate in. That night, I decided to file for divorce. But the next morning, before I could even call my lawyer, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. It was her department chair. And what he told me made everything even more complicated. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but carried that tone people use when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear. He introduced himself, Dr. Levin, her department chair, and said he needed to talk to me as a courtesy. Apparently, my wife, or ex-wife, depending on how you count, had checked herself into a psychiatric evaluation program. He said it wasn't court-ordered or anything. She did it voluntarily after a professional intervention. I didn't know what to say. My first reaction was disbelief. The woman who could quote Oppenheimer and debate entropy at dinner didn't seem like the kind who'd break down. But then again, nothing about the last few weeks had made sense. Dr. Levin told me that her colleagues had grown worried after reading her unpublished research notes, the same kind I found in that notebook. They said her behavior had become erratic, obsessive. She'd stopped teaching, stopped answering emails, spent nights alone in the lab. Then he said something that made my stomach twist. Mr. Hale, she wasn't just studying Oppenheimer. She was trying to replicate his emotional trajectory. Apparently, she'd written in her proposal that she wanted to experience the moral implosion of creation firsthand. In her words, she wanted to feel what it meant to destroy something beautiful for the sake of understanding it. He said they'd found journal entries suggesting she planned to write a book based on the experiment. Our marriage was going to be the core case study. It was supposed to be called the Human Manhattan Project. I didn't say a word. I just listened. I think he realized how messed up it sounded because he added, "She mentioned you often. Said you were the only part of the project she regretted." After the call, I sat there staring at the wall for a long time. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was grief for someone who'd completely lost herself chasing the ghost of a man who'd once said, "Now I am become death." For the first time since it all began, I didn't feel angry at her. I just felt scared for her. Scared for how far a mind can go when it stops distinguishing between genius and madness. That night, I drove to the facility where she was being treated. I didn't plan to go in. I just sat in the parking lot. But as I was about to leave, a nurse came out and handed me an envelope. It was from her. Again, the envelope was sealed with the same neat precision she used on everything. Like even her breakdown had to be methodical. I sat in my car, engine off, rain starting to tap against the windshield, and just stared at it for a while. When I finally tore it open, there were only 2 pages this time. Her handwriting looked different, uneven, shaky, like the words were fighting to come out. The first line read, "If you're reading this, it means I've finally stopped trying to explain myself." She wrote that the doctors told her she was suffering from delusional idealization with obsessive analytical tendencies. She said it wasn't insanity. It was a scientist's mind turning inward on itself. Then she admitted something that hit me harder than anything before. There was never an affair. There was a simulation. She described how she and
I ended
MG
up
had
doing
set
neither.
out to create a
Instead,
controlled
I spent the next
emotional
week
collapse
walking around
to test
aimlessly,
the concept
revisiting
of
places
guilt
that
and
held
moral
memories.
displacement
Our
under
favorite coffee
artificial
shop,
stress.
the campus library where we
Essentially,
first
to
met,
mirror
the small
Oppenheimer's
science museum
psychological
where
arc
we
in
took
a
that
modern,
photo.
emotional
Everywhere I
context.
went, I could
The
hear her voice in
relationship
my head,
wasn't real.
quoting
They'd
Oppenheimer,
staged it.
dissecting
But I
atoms,
wasn't supposed to
dissecting
find
us.
out.
It was
Not yet.
terrifying
The
and
goal was
oddly
to
illuminating.
observe her own
I realized I
reactions
couldn't
and
fight her
mine,
experiment,
to see how
couldn't
truth,
control her mind or the
suspicion,
damage she'd
and love
caused, but I
decompose
could control
under moral
myself.
radiation.
I finally
In
made a
short,
decision.
she'd
I
been
would proceed
experimenting
with the
on me.
divorce,
Then
not
came
out
the
of
part
anger,
that
but
shattered
to
me
preserve the
completely.
part of me that
When
still
you found
mattered.
the essay,
I couldn't let
when you
my life
started
become a
pulling
footnote
away,
in her
it
pursuit
stopped
of
being a
understanding
simulation.
genius and
I
guilt.
began to feel
I
it.
drafted the papers,
That's when I knew I'd
signed
gone
them,
too
and left
far.
them on her
She
treatment
ended the
facility's
letter with
front
something
desk.
that still
No
makes my chest
confrontation,
ache
no
whenever I
dramatic
think
reveal,
about it.
just
You were
facts,
supposed to be
like
my
a measured
constant,
reaction to a
but
controlled
instead,
experiment
you became
gone
my
wrong.
mirror.
And then,
And I
for
couldn't
the
bear
first
what I
time in
saw.
months, I
At the
breathed.
bottom of the
Once the
page,
divorce was
she'd drawn a
finalized,
small
life
atomic
didn't
symbol.
suddenly feel
Underneath
lighter.
it,
If
in tiny
anything,
writing,
the world
I
felt
didn't
a little
destroy the
hollow,
world.
like the
I
echo of a
destroyed the
lab
only
experiment
person
that
who
had gone
believed
off
in me.
inside my life.
I don't remember much
But
after
slowly,
that.
I started
Just sitting there
noticing
in
the
the
small
rain,
things again.
feeling like
The way
every
sunlight hit
piece
my
of logic
apartment
in
in the
my
morning,
brain
the
had been
quiet hum of my
rearranged.
old coffee
Because
machine,
somehow,
the way
it was
strangers
worse than an
smiled on the
affair.
street.
She
I
hadn't
realized
cheated
that
on
I'd
me.
been living in
She'd
someone
used me,
else's
turned
experiment for
love
months,
into data.
and part of
And
healing
the
was
craziest
reclaiming
part,
my own
I still
reality.
missed her.
I didn't need to
After
understand
reading
her,
that letter,
and I
I didn't
certainly
sleep for
didn't
2
need her
nights.
approval or
I
forgiveness.
kept going over her
I just needed to
words,
live.
the
I also
atomic
started
symbol,
reading
the
about
mirror
Oppenheimer.
metaphor.
Finally,
Part of me
outside
wanted
of
to
her
storm
lens.
into the
The man
facility,
who created the
demand
atomic bomb,
answers, even a
admired and
hug,
hated in
something
equal
tangible.
measure, became a
Another part of
strange
me
mirror
wanted
for
to
our
burn the
story.
letters,
Like him,
erase her from my
sometimes people
life,
carry the
and
weight
never
of
think
creation
about her
they
again.
can't fully understand. But unlike him, I didn't build weapons. I just allowed someone else's obsession to shadow my life. I forgave her in the quietest way possible. Not for her, but for me. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It means refusing to carry the destruction forward. Looking back, I see now how easy it is to get swept into someone else's storm without realizing it. My advice to anyone who might be in a similar situation: trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. I ignored the subtle shifts at first, thinking I was overreacting. Boundaries are not negotiable. Emotional experiments, manipulations, or blurred lines, whatever you want to call them, are not a reflection of your worth. Protect your space and your sanity. Emotions can be weaponized. Even someone you love can turn your feelings into data for their own ends. Recognize when affection is being used as a tool rather than a genuine connection. Control what you can. I couldn't control her mind or her choices, but I could control mine. Walking away legally and emotionally was the only way to reclaim my life. Healing is quiet. You don't need dramatic closure. Sometimes showing up for yourself, day after day, is enough. Most importantly, I learned that love doesn't have to be a destructive force. It can be, if the other person decides to experiment with it. And when it becomes destructive, the only way forward is to step out of the blast radius. The first few months after the divorce were brutal. I went through the motions, work, gym, friends. But inside, I felt like I was walking through fallout. Memories of her, the essays, the letters, the notebook, they kept replaying like a film I couldn't turn off. But gradually, life started to feel less like an experiment and more like living. I reconnected with old friends, spent more time on hobbies I had abandoned, and even started dating again. Carefully, cautiously, with boundaries in place. What surprised me most was how resilient I was. Despite everything, I discovered that my sense of self hadn't been destroyed. It had been tested, yes, but it survived. Like Oppenheimer in his own way, I carried the weight of creation and destruction, but I learned to distinguish between the two. I also started writing again. Not essays about atomic physics or emotional experiments, just my own thoughts, raw and unfiltered. It was therapeutic, and each page felt like reclaiming a little bit of the life I'd almost lost. Looking back on everything, the essays, the letters, the notebooks, the emotional explosions, I've come to a strange kind of peace. I can't say I understand her, or why she needed to turn our marriage into a laboratory, or why she saw me as a variable instead of a partner. Maybe I never will. But I do understand one thing. Love, even when it's manipulated, still leaves a mark. And life, even after betrayal and manipulation, goes on. I've learned to protect my boundaries, trust my instincts, and recognize when someone's emotional experiments are no longer safe to participate in. I've also learned that sometimes the hardest thing isn't leaving someone. It's leaving the idea of them, the story you thought you were living together. That part takes time, patience, and a lot of self-compassion. So here's my advice to anyone in a similar situation: value yourself. Your emotions are not data points, and your love is not a lab experiment. Step back when you feel manipulated, and don't be afraid to walk away, even if it's messy, even if it hurts. The world outside the fallout zone is still waiting, and it's full of life that won't try to study you. And me? I still think about her sometimes. But now, I think about myself first. And that's enough.